Guys, welcome back. Today we are going to be doing another active reading of your story for this week, which is Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. Let's go ahead and get started. It has been assigned to you on Common Lit. So, Harrison Bergeron was written by Kurt Vonnegut in 1961. Vonnegut was an American writer best known for his novel Slaughterhouse-Five. In this short story, all citizens have been made equal. But at what cost? So we are going to begin with paragraph 1. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law. They were equal in every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution and to the unceasing vigilance of the agents of the United States Handicapper General. So, in that very first paragraph, it's letting us know that this is a very different world. So, second paragraph. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the H.G. men took George and Harrison's Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. So, let's remember that HG stands for Handicapper General, so that basically the people who handicap people took away their son. So let's remember that Harrison Bergeron has just been taken away from his parents. So, paragraph 3. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was turned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. Okay, let's pause again for just 1 second to talk about that. So what that looks like, guys, is like an old school Bluetooth headphone. This guy, anyone who tests as having more than average intelligence, it has been said that they have to wear this little radio in their ear. And about every 20 seconds, there is a sharp noise in the radio. And what that does is it keeps you from having a real train of thought about something. It's keeping you from taking unfair advantage of your brain. So going back to the story, we're on paragraph 4 now. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. Paragraph 5. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic like bandits from a burglar alarm. That was a real pretty dance, that dance they just did, said Hazel. Huh? Said George. That dance. It was nice, said Hazel. Paragraph 10. Yup, said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good, no better than anybody else would have been in any way. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face, would feel like something the cat had drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped. But he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. So, let's pause again for that. So, the dancers have to wear weights and cover their faces so they won't make anyone else feel bad. Like, why am I not as pretty as her? In this world, no one's particularly pretty. If you are pretty, you have to wear something over your face. And then I want to also point out to you that, George hears a sound in his ear and he winces. And on the screen in front of them, they can see the ballerina, or 2 of the ballerinas wince as well, which is letting you know that they are of above average intelligence. So they had to be handicapped. Okay. Going back to our story, Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George. I think it would be real interesting hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up. Paragraph 15. Said George. Only, if I was handicap or general, do you know what I would do? Hazel said. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes. Kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Paragraph 20. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21 gunshot salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, were holding their temples. All of a sudden you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padded around George's neck. Go on and rest that bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. Paragraph 25. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately. Kind of wore out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and take out a few of them lead balls, just a few. 2 years in prison and a $200 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take a few out when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people'd get away with it. And pretty soon we'd be right back in the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? So that was paragraph 29. And I want to pause for a moment to just talk about what's going on. So, like the dancers, George has to wear a weight around his neck to make him more equal to everyone else, to sort of slow down his mental processing in this idea that it would make everyone equal. And so Hazel, his wife, sees that it tears him out and wears him out. So she suggests they try and remove some of the weight. But did y'all catch that your punishment, if you remove the bird shot, which they're little like BBs, that might not make sense either, but they're little tiny weights, and so for each little circle that you take out, each spear, it's a $2,000 fine for every ball that you take out, and 2 years in prison. So you could seriously get in trouble for that if you got caught. And he's saying, we can't do that, because then someone else would do that, and if everybody did it, we'd be right back where we started, with everyone competing. And Hazel agrees that she would not like that. Okay, so let's keep moving forward with paragraph 30. I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to the question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. Reckon it'd fall apart, said Hazel. What would? George said blankly. Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all the announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. That's all right, Hazel said of the announcer. He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do it the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. Paragraph 40. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was an unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, timeless melody. Excuse me, she said, and began again, her voice absolutely uncompetitive. Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween in hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches besides. Paragraph 45. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people. But Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, "do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him." There was a shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. Paragraph 50. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have, for many times in his own home had danced the same crashing tune. "My God," said George, "that must be Harrison." The realization was blasted from his mind instantly, though, by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor," cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everyone must do as I say at once." He stamped his foot and the studio shook. Paragraph 55. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become." Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his head harness. The balls snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. Paragraph 60. "I shall now select my empress," he said, looking down on the cowering people. "Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet claim me as her mate and her throne." A moment passed. Then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the metal handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. "Now," said Harrison, taking her hand, Shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance? Music, he commanded. Paragraph 65. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. Play your best, he told them, and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls. The music began. It was normal at first. Cheap, silly, false. But Harrison snatched two musicians from their chair, waved them like batons as he sang the music he wanted it played. He slammed them back into their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weight to their toes. Paragraph 70. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, swirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gamboled, and spun. They leaped like deers on the moon. Paragraph 75. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air, inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the emperor and empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. Paragraph 80. It was then that the Bergeron's television burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had finally gone into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You've been crying," he said to Hazel. "Yup," she said. "What about?" he asked. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. Paragraph 90. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was a sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel, "I could tell that one was a doozy." And that's the end of Harrison Bergeron. I will be posting another video talking about your writing prompts for the week. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that story gave you something to think about. Thank you. Bye.